When someone who identifies with an avoidant attachment style is in a relationship, they often lean on a certain predictable rhythm. They've grown accustomed to their partner reaching out, asking questions, and putting in the effort to keep the connection alive. For the avoidant, this constant pursuit provides a quiet reassurance. No matter how much they withdraw, no matter how much they distance themselves, the anxious partner will always be there to close the gap. It creates a sense of control, not in a malicious way, but in a way that feeds into their unconscious need to protect themselves from vulnerability. The avoidant learns to rely on the idea that the relationship will not collapse because the other person is always the one propping it up. But when that cycle is interrupted and the anxious suddenly stops chasing, the avoidant feels an unexpected ripple inside. What they thought was security now begins to feel like shaky ground, and the loss of control unsettles them in ways they may not even fully understand. For the avoidant, control is often less about dominating and more about managing emotional distance. They are comfortable as long as they get to dictate the pace of closeness, leaning in only when it feels safe and retreating the moment intimacy stirs up old fears. When the anxious partner respects that pattern and continues to reach out, the avoidant feels they can maintain their distance without consequence. But once the anxious decides to step back, to withhold the messages, the reassurances, and the constant energy of pursuit, the avoidant can no longer manage the relationship on their own terms. Suddenly, they aren't the one calling the shots anymore. And that shift challenges the emotional safety net they've built for themselves. What was once predictable becomes uncertain, and avoidants do not thrive in uncertainty. The unsettling feeling comes not just from the silence itself, but from the deeper meaning behind it. When the anxious stops pursuing, the avoidant is forced to confront the possibility that they are no longer in control of whether the relationship continues. This flips the script entirely. For perhaps the first time, the avoidant has to consider what it feels like to be on the receiving end of distance, to be the one wondering instead of being wondered about. That realization stirs anxiety they aren't used to processing. They may not name it as fear of loss, but it often shows up as agitation, restlessness, or sudden bursts of thought about the partner they once dismissed. The very thing they once claimed to want, space, now feels heavier because it was not given on their terms. This loss of control often reveals truths the avoidant works hard to avoid facing. As long as the anxious keeps pursuing, the avoidant never has to ask themselves whether they genuinely want to stay, because the decision is always deferred. They can coast along, protected by the other person's investment, but when the chasing stops, they are forced into the uncomfortable position of making a choice. Do they step forward and risk vulnerability, or do they let the connection fade and admit that they might lose something meaningful? That choice pulls them out of their comfort zone and strips away the illusion that they can have both distance and guaranteed security at the same time. It is in that tension that the avoidant begins to feel truly unsettled because they no longer hold the invisible reins. For some avoidants, this shift sparks denial or even irritation. They may criticize the anxious partner for suddenly being distant, framing it as coldness or immaturity, not realizing that what they are actually reacting to is the loss of their own leverage. For others, it sparks quiet reflection, though they may not share it openly. They start noticing how much effort the anxious had been giving all along, and in that recognition comes a tinge of regret. No matter how it manifests, the internal experience is deeply unsettling because it disrupts the established dynamic where the avoidant always felt buffered from the risk of rejection. Now, they too have to face the possibility of being left behind, and that loss of control is a powerful wake-up call. When an avoidant partner pulls back, they often believe they are claiming the space they need to breathe, to feel free, to protect their independence. They tell themselves that distance gives them clarity and shields them from feeling overwhelmed. In many ways, it is their comfort zone, the place where they think they are most in control of their emotions and their lives. But when the anxious partner, the one who usually fills that space with texts, reassurance, and attention, stops doing so, the dynamic changes dramatically. What once felt like freedom begins to feel like silence, and what once looked like safety quickly reveals itself as emptiness. The absence is no longer a breath of fresh air, it becomes a void, For the avoidant, this shift can be confusing because at first it may seem like nothing is different. They might enjoy the quiet or the lack of pressure. But human beings are wired for connection, even those who are deeply avoidant. The nervous system, whether anxious or avoidant, still craves the feeling of being seen, valued, and wanted. When no one is reaching for them, the avoidant starts to notice a hollowness. It is the difference between choosing solitude and having solitude imposed on you. One feels empowering, the other feels like rejection. Even if they do not admit it outright, this emptiness grows stronger when they realize that the silence is not accidental. The anxious person is no longer filling their world with constant attention, and that absence highlights just how much the avoidant relied on the other person's efforts to maintain the connection. Avoidants often convince themselves that they do not need anyone, yet the sudden quiet reveals how much they have come to expect, even depend on the pursuit. The texts that once felt suffocating are suddenly missed. The check-ins that felt like pressure are now remembered as care, and the anxious partner's persistence, once overwhelming, now becomes proof of love that is no longer there. In that silence, memories begin to echo louder. The avoidant might find themselves replaying moments of closeness, realizing that the anxious partner's presence gave their life more texture than they thought. The laughter at a shared joke, the comfort of a message in the middle of the day, the simple knowledge that someone was waiting to hear from them, all of it begins to feel like a loss. And with that sense of loss comes a creeping loneliness. The very thing they thought they wanted, endless space, has turned into the very thing they were trying to avoid, the pain of disconnection. This transformation is not just emotional, it is psychological. Emptiness has a way of forcing reflection. When the avoidant is left alone in the silence, they begin to confront questions they usually push away. Why does this feel so uncomfortable? Why do I suddenly miss what I once rejected? Why does freedom feel heavy rather than light? The mind, left with no one to distract it, begins to look inward, and in that process, the avoidant is often faced with truths about their own need for intimacy that they have long tried to bury. Ultimately, what happens when space turns into emptiness is that the avoidant is confronted with the paradox of their own behavior. They wanted distance to feel free, but they discover that distance without effort from the other person feels like abandonment. They wanted control, but they realize control without connection feels like isolation. And while not every avoidant will admit it, that emptiness is a powerful wake-up call. It forces them to acknowledge that space is only valuable when it is temporary, when it is followed by return, when it exists inside a bond that is strong enough to hold them even when they step away. Without that, space is just loneliness wearing a mask, and emptiness is the cost of running too far from the very thing they truly need. When an anxious partner stops reaching out, one of the most striking things that happens to the avoidant is the way memories begin to resurface. It's not always immediate because avoidants often train themselves to compartmentalize and push feelings to the back of their mind. At first, they may convince themselves that the silence is a relief, that the absence of texts and calls is exactly what they wanted. But the human mind doesn't work that neatly. Over time, when the constant reassurance is no longer there to fall back on, the avoidant finds themselves replaying moments that they didn't pay much attention to before. That small smile across the dinner table, the warmth of a hand reaching for theirs, the care put into remembering little details about their day. These become more vivid once they're gone. What seemed ordinary starts to take on a new significance in the quiet of distance. The irony is that while the anxious partner was present, these gestures could feel suffocating to the avoidant. They might have brushed them aside, downplayed their importance, or even distanced themselves further in response. Yet absence has a way of sharpening appreciation. When the source of consistent affection disappears, the mind begins to treasure what it once dismissed. The avoidant may recall arguments, but alongside those, they will remember how the anxious partner always came back to patch things up, how they cared enough to fight for the relationship rather than walk away. These memories come uninvited, often late at night or in quiet moments when distractions fade. What they reveal is not just nostalgia, but the depth of the bond that was present all along. This resurfacing of memories is powerful because it challenges the avoidant's own narrative. Many avoidants build a sense of security by convincing themselves that they don't really need closeness, that independence is safer than vulnerability. But when the anxious person withdraws, the memories prove otherwise. The laughter they shared, the way they felt seen, the comfort of not having to explain every little thing, these aren't just passing details, they're reminders of a connection that mattered. The avoidant starts to realize that the comfort they once took for granted was a rare form of intimacy, one that doesn't easily come around again. The past, instead of staying in the past, becomes a mirror reflecting what is now missing in the present. As these memories resurface, they stir emotions the avoidant often tries to suppress. Longing, regret, and even guilt can start to creep in. They may find themselves missing the very intensity they once tried to escape. This doesn't always translate into immediate action, but it unsettles their emotional equilibrium. A song might remind them of a car ride together. A familiar place might trigger a flash of a shared moment. And suddenly the avoidant is caught off guard by feelings they believed they had neatly buried. It is in these small but persistent reminders that the walls around their heart begin to crack. They may not rush to confess it, but internally, the avoidant is grappling with a recognition that what they lost had more value than they allowed themselves to admit. Ultimately, the resurfacing of memories acts as a quiet wake-up call. It teaches the avoidant that connection leaves an imprint that cannot be erased simply by choosing distance. Ignoring an anxious partner may look like detachment on the surface, but deep inside their mind holds on to the pieces of love and care that once grounded them. Those memories don't fade. In fact, they grow louder in silence. And in that silence, the avoidant begins to feel not only the absence of the person, but also the weight of the bond that still lingers within them. When an avoidant begins to feel the impact of an anxious partner stepping back, one of the most fascinating and telling shifts happens in the way they express themselves. For so long, avoidants rely on a strategy of distance and detachment. They keep their emotions guarded, they delay vulnerability, and they avoid situations that might force them to feel dependent on someone else. This is their armor. It protects them from discomfort, from fear of rejection, and from intimacy that feels overwhelming. But when the anxious partner suddenly stops reaching out, stops sending the good morning texts, stops initiating the late night conversations, the avoidant starts to notice that silence more than they ever admitted they would. In that silence, tiny cracks begin to form in the emotional armor they once thought was indestructible. These cracks often reveal themselves in subtle ways. The avoidant may send a quick message, something that looks casual on the surface, like, "Hey, how's your week going?" Or even a simple emoji on social media. To most people, these gestures seem insignificant, but for an avoidant, they carry weight. It's not the message itself that matters. It's the act of reaching out when they were once comfortable letting the other person always initiate. That slight move is a breach in their own defenses. It's an indirect admission that they feel the distance, that they notice the absence, and that they're not as unaffected as they'd like others to believe. What looks like a casual touch point is actually a window into their deeper emotional unease. As the cracks widen, the avoidant may start behaving inconsistently. They might oscillate between silence and sudden bursts of communication. One day they'll act like nothing's changed, keeping the same guarded demeanor, but the next day they'll send a message late at night, when their defenses are lower, just to feel some form of connection. This inconsistency is confusing for both sides, but it's also revealing. It shows that despite their best efforts to remain detached, the avoidant is struggling to maintain their protective wall. Their need for connection, which they've spent so much time suppressing, begins to surface in ways they can't completely control. It's important to remember that avoidants aren't immune to feelings. They've simply learned to manage those feelings by withdrawing. When they sense that the anxious partner is no longer chasing, it unsettles the very system they've built to stay safe. Their usual tactics of ignoring messages or keeping conversations shallow suddenly don't provide the same comfort. Instead, those tactics backfire, leaving them restless, distracted, and compelled to break their silence. That restlessness is the sound of their armor bending under pressure. Each attempt to reach out, however small, is their subconscious trying to bridge the gap, before it grows too wide. Over time, these cracks can create opportunities for real change. If the anxious partner remains consistent in stepping back, not as a game, but as a way of reclaiming balance and self-respect, the avoidant has to confront something they've avoided all along, the fact that closeness matters to them too. Their small gestures of vulnerability, though awkward and hesitant, can be the beginning of a different pattern. It doesn't guarantee transformation overnight, but it does show that even the strongest armor cannot hold forever when faced with the quiet power of absence. In those cracks, the truth emerges. The avoidant does feel, they do care, and when the anxious stops giving everything, the avoidant is forced to reveal pieces of themselves they usually keep hidden. When the anxious partner steps back and no longer feeds the cycle of pursuit, something subtle but powerful happens within the avoidant. For so long, they have relied on the predictability of being chased. That constant reassurance has given them the comfort of knowing that, no matter how distant or unavailable they become, someone will still reach for them. It has been a safety net, one that allowed them to keep their walls intact without ever fully confronting the consequences of those walls. But when that net is taken away, when the anxious partner no longer plays that role, the avoidant is left standing on their own, and it is in that silence that self-reflection begins. At first, this reflection feels foreign, almost intrusive. The avoidant has built an identity around independence, self-sufficiency, and sometimes even superiority in their detachment. To admit that they miss someone's presence or effort can feel like weakness. Yet, as the silence stretches, they start asking themselves questions they have long avoided. Why did I push them away? Why did I need so much distance? Why, now that they are gone, do I feel this emptiness? These questions stir discomfort because they reveal contradictions between what the avoidant claims to want, freedom and space, and what they actually need, which is connection and emotional closeness. This moment of self-reflection often exposes patterns that go far beyond the current relationship. Many avoidants are shaped by past experiences of disappointment, rejection, or feeling unsafe with intimacy. By holding people at arm's length, they protect themselves from reliving that pain. But when the anxious partner withdraws, the avoidant is confronted with the reality that their defense mechanism is not only protecting them from hurt, it is also protecting them from love, stability, and companionship. That realization can be jarring, almost like a mirror showing them the cost of their behavior for the first time. The longer the anxious partner remains absent, the more the avoidant is forced to wrestle with this internal conflict. Their mind begins to wander back to the small moments they dismissed. The kind words, the thoughtful gestures, the simple act of someone choosing them over and over again. Suddenly, those things are no longer annoyances or pressures. They become treasures that now feel scarce in this shift. The avoidant begins to see the anxious partner not as someone too much, but as someone who was giving what they themselves could not bring themselves to offer. That recognition plants the seed of accountability. Accountability is a difficult step for an avoidant because it means acknowledging that their actions, or lack thereof, have consequences. It means seeing that distance isn't just a neutral preference, it actively shapes the emotional environment of the relationship. This is the first crack in the illusion that they can live in isolation and still maintain meaningful connection. Reflection turns their gaze inward, making them question not only how they interact with others, but what kind of partner they truly want to be. Do they want to be someone who consistently avoids, or someone who learns to show up? Not every avoidant will act on this realization immediately, but the self-reflection is undeniable. It lingers like a shadow, even if they try to push it aside. And once that awareness is awakened, it becomes harder for them to escape the truth that intimacy requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires effort. The withdrawal of the anxious partner doesn't just change the dynamics of the relationship. It changes the avoidant's perception of themselves. It shows them that their patterns are not sustainable if they genuinely desire love, and that truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. When someone with an anxious attachment pattern finally decides to stop chasing and instead leans back into their own peace, a subtle but powerful shift begins to take place in the relationship dynamic. The anxious has often been the one carrying the weight of communication, checking in, smoothing conflicts, and reassuring the avoidant partner over and over again. But when that pattern is interrupted, when the anxious turns that energy inward instead of outward, the balance of the connection begins to restore itself. It is not about punishing the avoidant or playing games. It is about finally recognizing that healthy love cannot exist if one person is doing all the emotional labor while the other hides behind distance. In the silence that follows, something new emerges, a space where both partners have to decide how much they are willing to show up for each other. For the avoidant, this change is unsettling at first because they are used to having control over the pace and rhythm of closeness. They pull back, the anxious follows, and in that chase they feel secure, knowing that affection is always guaranteed, even if they withhold their own. But when that dynamic stops, when the anxious no longer rushes in to fix everything, the avoidant feels a gap they did not anticipate. What once felt like freedom suddenly begins to echo as loneliness, because connection, even when overwhelming, is still the glue that gives relationships meaning. In that quiet, they begin to notice what they had, the warmth of being wanted, the small reassurances that someone cared enough to try again and again. The absence of it makes them feel their own need more honestly, even if they do not yet know how to express it. Meanwhile, for the anxious person, the act of stepping back is a radical return to self. Instead of constantly scanning for the avoidance signals, they begin listening to their own needs, asking what they deserve, and reclaiming energy that had always been poured outward. In doing so, they learn to regulate their own sense of worth without waiting for validation from someone who was too guarded to give it freely. This process is uncomfortable because silence can feel like rejection, but it is also liberating because it creates space for growth. The anxious starts to discover a new confidence. Love is not proven by how hard you chase, but by how well you value yourself even when someone else does not meet you halfway. Balance is restored not when the avoidance suddenly changes overnight, but when both partners are forced to face reality without the old patterns clouding it. The avoidant has to choose whether they will step forward and risk vulnerability or let the silence confirm their fears of closeness. The anxious has to decide whether they will hold that silence as a boundary, refusing to return to the exhausting cycle of pursuit. Out of that tension comes clarity. If the avoidant genuinely cares, they may begin to meet the anxious person in the middle, recognizing that love requires presence, not just distance. And if they do not, the anxious person has already begun the journey of finding balance within themselves, which is the foundation for healthier relationships in the future. When anxious stops chasing and avoidant feels the shift, both are given the chance to grow. One learns that freedom without connection is hollow, and the other learns that love without self-respect is unsustainable. This is what it means for self-balance to be restored, not perfection, not certainty, but a recalibration where both people are given the responsibility to decide what they truly want. It is in this space that genuine intimacy can either take root or gracefully release, but either way, both individuals emerge stronger, clearer, and more aligned with what they deserve.